what have we seen so far with trying out MVC? So all of this falls under a paradigm of aspect-oriented programming. So think about a way of implementing cross-cutting concerns in a single place in our application that documents how they should work. Ruby's goal isn't to do full-scale aspect-oriented programming, but to provide some of the benefits predefined point cuts. So we're not going to do this everywhere, but in things like models where we have update and save that can be called from multiple places, in controller actions, we're going to set up places where we can define one function or one set of rules that work everywhere in their application. So we've seen validations. They sort of check that certain properties about our model exist. Controller filters check or assert that certain properties about our controller are true before continuing on. And all these fall under sort of the reasons that we might want to dry out our code. In the previous module, we saw partials. So partials dry out our views. Controller filters and validations help along the same design pattern. So controller filters and validations, they work in similar ways. The gist, though, is that validations applied to the model, they assert properties about the data that happens in our model. And if those validations fail, they prevent the data from being saved. When a validation fails, we will typically see the error information added to the errors object on a model. And when a controller action fails, we use things like the flash or the session to pass data back to the user. If a controller action fails, and this is an API-based app, we might use a different technique, like returning a different HTTP error code, like 400 or something for not authorized.
The goal here is to think about what are the other things that we might need to do in an advanced Rails app. And so we have our model view controller pattern. So far, we've been placing code in our controllers, our models, and our views, and we've been trying to keep them fairly small and slim at most cases. We're passing parameters around, we're specifying some validations, but how do we think about some of the complexities here? And all of these with MVC rely on trying to follow the best pattern. So minimize the code that you have in your views. It makes sense to render a for loop, but don't perhaps minimize the conditionals. No code in views is the goal, just rendering individual resources. Obviously, small amounts of code will exist. The other bit of advice, no fat controller methods. Move that logic probably to the model or to somewhere else, such that the controller focuses on the logic of just rendering the right kinds of data and passing that to the view. So what happens when things get complicated? Do we just shove all the rest of the code into a model? Well, if we're asking the question this way, no. There are lots of other places that we might want to think about structuring our application. So there's at least 3 other kinds of places to put code. We could factor out code from our sort of main classes into modules and other kinds of classes. And we can dry out code for repetitive tasks. And we can encapsulate coupling in new kinds of classes. And so some examples of these. When we're factoring out code, there are lots of different types of patterns that might apply, but some of the ones that you might see, presenter objects, value objects, or adapter or decorator classes, these are all tools that help us build a class whose goal is to format the data in a way that is suitable for presentation. So you might imagine in a complicated app, especially one with a lot of nested data, that you want to render specific fields. You want to handle different kinds of things like what's shown to what kinds of users, especially when it comes to applications that have varying levels of user permissions. You might need to restrict who can see what kinds of data. Presenter classes, adapter patterns help give you one logical place in your app to put some of this functionality. Rails by default provides view helpers, which give you additional functions that are in a helpers class that you can call from your views. And there's also other common patterns there. In Rails, there's new functionality called concerns. And concerns are just a standard set of simple modules that live in models/concerns or controllers/concerns that let us do shared kind of functionality. So perhaps you have a series of searchable filtering classes that you might apply to your database queries to filter by common attributes. You might have some business reporting logic so that every night you need to tidy up some data, run some reports. Those types of things can go in a folder called concerns that show that logic. And of course, tasks like database maintenance, cleaning up data, those typically go in a common folder. So if you have automations that you need to run, there's typically this is lib/tasks. Rake will automatically pick those up. And then finally, when we say encapsulate coupling among models, there's a lot of patterns for this. The most common one is a service object. And a service object is in some ways nothing more than just a plain Ruby class. But the idea here is to think about intentionally extracting functionality from one model or from one controller into a shared class that can be called in multiple places. Service objects are great places to carve out interactions with external services. So if a model perhaps needs to interact with some third-party API, we move that logic out of the model into its own class. And all of these things will help promote testability and reusability. When it comes to authorization, policy objects are a common design pattern that give us a shared place to specify what kinds of users can do what kinds of actions. And there's a bunch of Rails tools that help with that. So where might you put some of these things? Rails tries to provide standard places. And of course, if you need to, you can override them. Automations typically go in lib/tasks. Every Rails app, even ones that use Rails for the command line, come with Rake as the task runner for Ruby. So if we have Rake as a program, we can say lib/tasks, and it automatically picks up how to run scripts. So complicated migrations, general maintenance, those types of things go there. Rails, I mentioned, includes app/concerns. It also includes app/model/concerns to further refactor things if you need to. And what if we have, no sort of specific idea about where something should go, but we want it to be sort of shared amongst pieces in our app? Rails by default loads all the files in our app subdirectory. So if you need to, you can just create subdirectories within there and Rails will pick them up automatically. Otherwise, if we're thinking about a code repository, there might be other logical places, but Rails won't load those files automatically. So we'd need to jump into a configuration, tell it how to load additional files. Perfectly possible if we need to. But the main thing here is that when we say, no fat controller methods, also want to think about the fact that overly large models are also a code smell, and that the more you can factor out of your models, the easier it becomes. The general thing here, right, is that when we're thinking about code, the less we have to read and the more declarative the code is about what's going on, the easier it is to understand and hopefully to debug and test that code as well.